Greetings. Welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Happy to have a new guest who is the director, editor, really the force behind this new amazing documentary treatment of remote viewing. And this is Lance Mungia. He just told me how to pronounce his name before, and I think I got it correctly.
Nailed it.
Nailed it. Lance, I'm really happy to have you on here, and welcome. I'm really looking forward to talking with you about remote viewing, about UFOs, which is part of our mutual interest, and your journey in putting together what I personally think is one of the most important new documentaries we've had in a long time. I've just felt there's not been something worthy of the remote viewing subject. And someone finally went and did it, and that was you. So congratulations.
Thank you, Richard. I really do appreciate that, and it's been a long journey for me as a filmmaker, and just in the last 3 days, our documentary has gone to #4 on the iTunes documentary charts, and is the third best-selling documentary right now on iTunes. So to me, I can't even express how that makes me feel after working on this for so long in sort of obscurity. And I quit my other job to work on this, and basically for other reasons too. But we don't need to go into that. But it's just been something where you're working in such isolation, and there's like nobody else around, and to now see people actually see this film and to hear what you just said about it, it blows me away. I mean, to know that we've actually got something out into the world about this.
There's nothing else that's like this, as far as I can tell, at least as far as a serious attempt at a reasonably comprehensive history of the remote viewing program. The famous remote viewing program from the 70s and 80s that Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ ran, and a number of other famous people were involved with, Ingo Swann and Joe McMoneagle and Pat Price. And you put together a very, very watchable, educational, and interesting treatment of that whole subject. Long overdue. So again, thank you for that. I think, and I'm glad that your film is doing well, and I hope it does even better still, because it deserves it. People really should be watching this. But can we just talk about remote viewing in general? This is one of these things where, like, I've had a personal interest in remote viewing long time. I do not any longer need to be convinced. But there are a lot of people out there who know very little about it. And even to this day, you get these folks within elements of the scientific community who have this idea that it's somehow shenanigans, somehow fakery. I can't understand how they can believe such a thing if they've had an opportunity to look at the evidence. But I just wonder if you can, because you've had your head in this for so long, and you followed Russell Targ around for 5 years, among other things. So your head's in the game, and I wonder if you can describe this phenomenon to people as best you can, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. I started out having never seen, somebody actually remote view, and not really knowing what the concept is. And a lot of times people get this confused with out-of-body projection. They get it confused with telekinesis, with there's a lot of different kind of categories of what you would call psychic ability. Remote viewing is something that happens when you are present, you're awake. You are not in an altered state. You're not taking LSD or something. You're not asleep. It's not dreaming. It's basically simply using the power of your own mind, your own consciousness, to reach out and to see things or people or places, even emotional feelings, things like that are hidden anywhere outside of space and time. So this is an ability that is not locked into the linear material world. Ingo Swann remote viewed the rings of Jupiter, when science did not even know that they existed, before any human on the planet had ever seen them, when the first probe actually got there. This is an ability that is not locked to any sort of material distance. And that's something that actually the Soviet Union spent decades studying. And one of the reasons that the Soviets were so interested in this during the Cold War was because communists are materialists. And they thought that there must be some sort of material radio wave or energy or something that goes from your head to whatever it is that you're looking at. And again, they proved that that's not the case. So we don't know yet exactly what the mechanism is that makes remote viewing actually work. What we do know is that it really does work, and that some people are really good at it. Other people can carry a tune and maybe just kind of get by and do a couple of things. But the bottom line is that it's just part of us being human. It's not scary. It's not weird. It's not something that should be hidden. It's just who we are. And Russell Targ's favorite saying, Russell Targ being one of the founders of the SRI program, whom you've interviewed and who has been my producing partner on this for a long time, says all you have to do is close your eyes. And when thinking of whatever it is you want to look at, just use your imagination as to where the person or place or thing might be. And then whatever the unexpected images are that come to your mind, where you kind of go, oh, what's that? You write that down. And that's it. It's as easy as that. And this is something that is not a new ability. It's not. Ingo Swann coined the phrase remote viewing. Ingo Swann was one of the greatest psychics in the world at the time. And he was somebody who was being studied by Stanford Research Institute under the tutelage of Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff. And he coined the modern phrase remote viewing because he was doing card tricks, these Gonsfeld, kind of card tricks in the lab where they say, guess what's in the envelope? And he said, this is silly. Like, you're having me do, dumb card tricks. I can see anywhere on the planet. Give me something better to look at. And
yeah, one of the things Russell pointed out in his conversation with me was that it's actually a lot easier to do a remote view when you have no boundaries whatsoever. So like with a card trick, you know that there's the 4 suits, and then there's 52 different cards, and your mind would be inclined to guess. And Russell said that's always the enemy of remote viewing. It's no guessing. So the more open the situation is, the more likely, which goes against all common sense.
Mm-hmm. It does, but there's a novelty effect and what's called like the Firsttimers Effect when it comes to doing something like remote viewing. So oftentimes people will get their best results looking at something the very first time that they do it. And the reason is because in parapsychology, there's a decline effect when you do the same thing over and over again and it's boring to you. If I'm looking at card tricks all day long and guessing what's in the envelope, after a while it gets really old and you start to second guess yourself. And there's all of this psychology that comes into play where you self-sabotage yourself. Mm-hmm. And it's not as apparent of a decline effect when you're actually looking at much bigger, harder to see things. So it's exactly the opposite of what you would think it is. You think, it's
totally
this card of the best. No, it's not.
So I'm going to tell you one other thing here, which no one else knows yet. So when I interviewed Russell a couple of weeks ago, I did a follow-up interview with him for my website. Mm-hmm. And for that, and that's just for members only of my site. And Tracy was with me, and we just did a 3-way conversation. And Russell shocked both of us during that by toward the end of it. He stopped everything. He said, okay, now I want both of you, we're going to do a remote view together. And I wasn't expecting this. Tracy's done, she was proficient. She was actually formally trained at the Monroe Institute in remote viewing, and she's very good. And she's had a very good track record of success. I've never done a remote view in my life, like never. Mm-hmm. So he says, we're going to do this. And the only reason it's not available at the moment is because he asked us not to talk about what we did a remote view on, because he's going to do a public version of that. And so but I'll just say this. I had no pressure at all because I thought, well, I'm not good at this anyway. Like what happens if I just fail? No biggie. And I wrote down qualities, and I drew a little something, and it turned out to be surprisingly accurate. I was very surprised. Yeah. Tracy did a little bit better, quite a bit better than I did, which is not surprising to me. But for me personally, he just said, okay, I just want you to do it, focus. And I didn't really overthink it. I just wrote a few things down, and it turned out that they were accurate. Now, I would not have been able to guess what it was, but what you learn with the process of remote viewing is to do it really well, you really, I think, want a team of remote viewers, and you need someone who's doing an analysis of it.
Yeah.
And that's where it works. But anyway, just that I would mention it. It went surprisingly well. I was quite surprised indeed.
You know, I kind of ascribed during the whole entire making of this film that to Russell's philosophy of being a scientist, which is that usually a scientist doesn't participate in their own experiments. You know, like they try to remain you know, unbiased and
Right.
stand back. And so I didn't like start taking remote viewing classes and jumping into doing remote viewing. I had in my life, I've had synchronicities, I've had weird things happen, I've had you know, intuitions about things that you tend to just sort of discard that stuff a lot of time as like, oh, maybe I'm just losing it or whatever. At least back before I knew about a lot of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was researching it, I did at one time. I was reading one of Joe McMoneagle's books, and Joe McMoneagle has written some really excellent books on the subject. I think it was called Mind Trek, and he's talking about how to do remote viewing, and I'm reading this in the car, you know, having just bought it at the bookstore, and I'm on my way to a restaurant, and I thought to myself, okay, this is ridiculous. I'm just gonna put the book down, and I'm gonna do this in the car right now. I'm gonna close my eyes. I'm gonna imagine what's the first thing that I'm gonna see when I walk in the door of the restaurant that I'm about to go have dinner at. You know, like what's the very first thing I'm gonna see? And I just kind of, and just for like a fraction of a second, I got this like burst in my mind's eye of a what looked like a red blooming rose, like just coming right into my point of view with all of looked like sparkles all over it, you know, and it was just a momentary flash. And I thought, well, that was an odd thing. And I just kind of left it at that. And then about 10 minutes later, I walk in the door of this restaurant. And at the time, it was close to Christmas time. And the very first thing you see as you open the door is this giant red bow that looks like a rose with all this glitter all over it, you know.
There you go.
And that was all I needed. I thought, well, you know, maybe there's, you know, really something to this.
It points out, I mean, there's a couple of things when you think about with remote viewing. So one is there's definitely a phenomenon that I think is beyond chance, beyond coincidence. But there was always a problem in terms of extracting valuable intelligence, right? Because like in your case, and certainly in the one time that I tried it, I wouldn't have been able to tell anyone what this was. So it wasn't usable intelligence in that regard. And that is the problem with it. And but it doesn't mean that you can't get usable intelligence, because the SRI program did. And I would love to hear you talk a bit more about that. Well, and then the fact is that the phenomenon itself just challenges our understanding of reality. But we've already gone into that a little bit. It's just that blows my mind every day I think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it completely changes the way that we have to look at the scientific model. You know, that's the most important aspect of this research. That's the thing that the 30 different PhDs that we interviewed, you know, for this film over a multi-year, you know, time period, all are the reason they want to talk about this, because it says that there's something wrong with the model, and
there has to be, because think of it. You've had examples in Third Eye Spies of remote viewers who are seeing the future. They're seeing things that haven't yet happened in our timeline. So that alone, and it's happened more than enough times, that we have to ask ourselves, how is this possible? How does that affect things like free will? How does that affect causality? So all of the things that we perceive as our reality, you know, time flowing like a river, one action causing another, suddenly remote viewing really challenges that. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the actual structure of this reality in which we find ourselves? And because no one can answer this. I asked Russell this question a few weeks ago, and he didn't really answer it, because how could he? He said, well, you know, every so often there's a revolution in physics. I'm like, yes, okay, I get that. But like, how do we explain this? And I have never met anyone who can really wrap their head around it.
Russell is somebody who, like everybody pretty much that we interviewed, it's like you have to like pull teeth to get them to make you know, like a really bold statement about science, because that's why the film is actually credible, because they only talk about stuff that they can actually observe. Now you and I are not limited by that. Like, I mean, we can go and look at all of the stuff that's happening and then kind of put it into this nice salad bowl and sort of hypothesize. But you can't hypothesize scientifically what the mechanism is to remote viewing, because you can't nail down consciousness.
Yeah,
You
I think that's it.
you can't say, well, how does consciousness work? You can see there's an effect. You can get really great results. But a hardcore theoretical or physicist is going to look at this and go, I can't come up with a theory of this because it's not reproducible in a way where I hit a button and then somebody can do exactly the same thing again and again.
Yeah.
So there's no theory. And the other issue here is that science is very compartmentalized. It's like medicine. It's like, oh, I'm the elbow doctor. I know all about your elbow. I know nothing about your nose. You got to go to the nose guy for that. And he doesn't read anything about the elbow. So you get a lot of guys like even Stephen Hawking or Neil deGrasse Tyson or very, very knowledgeable scientists who say, oh, there's nothing to ESP. It's never been proven. Yes, it has. It was proven 100 years ago, and it's been proven ever since, again and again and again. It's just like the UFO phenomenon, frankly.
Yeah.
You can observe a UFO in the sky. You can talk to thousands of people that see something, in the sky, or even have a close encounter, but you can't make a real theory of exactly where it's coming from, because you have no solid material thing that you can latch onto as to how it got here or where it went or anything else.
Well, unless you go into the basement down below level at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and they'll show you a couple of bodies and discs, but that'll be a whole other thing we could talk about. I really want to get into the UFO connection to remote viewing. But before we do that, because, for me, I got interested in remote viewing via the UFO subject many years ago. So for me, it's a personal thing. But before we do that, I don't want to do an injustice to this great achievement that you've done with this film. And would it be okay for you to walk listeners through just what this documentary really covers? Like what are the important things that you want people to get out of this achievement, this Third Eye Spies documentary of yours?
Well, the number one thing is that psychic abilities are real. Like that's not me saying that. I'm not hypothesizing, or it's not my belief. Like Russell always says, people always ask me, do you believe that ESP is real? And that's not an accurate question, because it's like saying, is a laser real? Is a bullet real? It's real because it's there.
Yeah, but you demonstrate that it's real in this documentary. Like, you've got amazing stories and amazing historical accounts of people like Pat Price, people like Ingo Swann, Joe McMoneagle, Helga Hammid, and many others. And if you could just describe a couple of those, I think people would love to hear some of these stories.
First off, when I first met Russ and we sat down to talk about making this documentary, even as open-minded as I thought I was at the time, and even as much research as I had already done, and I had done some, I started to wonder, is this guy pulling one over on me? Because there was so many incredible stories, and they just come out of Russell like a flowing river of like all this amazing information. And I realized at that point that this movie was only going to work if we actually were able to talk to these people as firsthand witnesses who were participating in these experiments while they were still alive. Because that was the concern of Russell's, is that he may pass, or Ingo Swann had passed away a couple of years before we really got into the documentary. So we didn't want to lose that very precious firsthand information, because it's so unbelievable that unless you talk to the person who was there, it was like being a Holocaust survivor. Like, I can read you statistics all day long about people who were killed in the Holocaust. That's meaningless if you don't actually talk to the people and get their testimony on record. And so that's really the way I approached this, and with the seriousness that I tried to approach the documentary, because I felt like if we didn't take it that seriously, that it would just be discounted and no one would pay attention to it. And that's really how we got people like Ken Kress, who was the undercover program manager for CIA at the project's inception in the 70s, and Kit Green and Hal Puthoff and so many other people, Brian Josephson, who's a Nobel laureate for quantum physics, to participate in the film was because people who really had looked at this phenomenon, not for entertainment purposes, but as looking at the model of science as to what this could mean for the human race, and spent their whole lives doing it. And if one of them says it, maybe they're a crackpot. If all of them say it, and you can look at the weight of the evidence, then it exists. You know, it makes it much more relevant. And they couldn't talk about it until now. You know, like there's been so many different documents that have been released in the last few years, but even today, like, you know, Ken Kress had to have every single one of his answers to questions vetted by CIA before he could talk about it. You know, so there's
still must be a great deal of that program that remains classified. Do you have any idea how much would be classified? Maybe
three years ago, Hal Puthoff told me that there was probably 70% of what had been done that was still classified as to what he knew. 70%
of the remote viewing program at SRI, it remains still classified.
SRI, but throughout government
and throughout
government, because SRI, you know, the other thing we don't. The way it's easy to marginalize this is to say that SRI was doing these incredible things, and they only got paid $20 million over 20 years, which is the price of a jet fighter, you know, and well, they must not have really cared that much about it. But that's not counting all of the other agencies of government that were using this. And some of them were relying upon SRI. There's evidence that there might have been things going on in other agencies that is still classified today. But we know for a fact that every intelligence agency was using this. Secret Service, Coast Guard, you know, NSA, you know, I mean, you name it, they all have stories. And the biggest client was the CIA, even when they were denigrating the program publicly. So that's intelligence.
Yeah, you know? Yeah. Well, right. When the program was revealed in the mid-1990s, the CIA went into overdrive to basically tell the world, no, we did it for a little while, but we didn't really have much actionable intelligence, and we've decided to discontinue it because it wasn't worthwhile. And that was the spin that they gave on it. And to this day, I think that there's a number of people who still accept that.
Yeah, I ran into a bias against it severely as a filmmaker. You know, I've done other films. You know, I haven't done a film in a while, but I would talk to filmmaker friends of mine and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about doing this project on this remote viewing thing." Why would you do that? That was completely debunked. You're going to ruin your reputation. You're going to.
Is this what you thought?
That's not what I thought. That's what I was told.
Other people. Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's what I was told by other people working in the industry. You know, and I looked into that. I thought that maybe there was something to that, and I looked at the evidence, and it just wasn't there. And I again and again I would ask them, could you please send me your evidence? You know, I'd like to see what sites you were looking at. I never got a good response other than Wikipedia. You know, and it's
so scandalously bad on all of these types of matters. I mean, whether it's UFOs or remote viewing or anything else on the fringe, it's unbelievably, but it's just gotten worse and worse over the years, I think.
But you asked me about what I thought were some of the highlights of the things that we covered, and frankly, one of the reasons that it took me a long time to finish the film was because there was so much information. You know, there was so many different stories that people had told me. I could have made 3 different documentaries with completely different sets of data, and they all would have been interesting. You know, it's a wealth of stuff that was done, and I had cuts of the film that were 3 hours long. You know, we talked about making it a 6-hour miniseries at one point. You know, we're still talking about possibly making it into a television show. You know, but it is incredible the types of stuff they did. But we decided upon a few key things where the key players were still alive that could talk about this, and where all of the evidence was there, and that they had been declassified, so we could talk about it. And then those were the key points that we talked about. You know, one of my favorites was the thing that started the whole program, which was an accidental break-in by Pat Price and Ingo Swann to the most secretive site that the NSA had in the United States, which is called Sugar Grove. and it's in Virginia, and it's for years it was a 100-mile no radio zone. You could not enter that 100-mile radius without a cell phone, without airwaves for radio, anything, because the NSA was doing secretive operational work there, and you couldn't have any signals. Well, at the inception of the SRI program, they were just doing, like I said, these card tricks and like very simple things. When Ingo Swann sort of started demonstrating that he could look anywhere, and psychically, and then they said, well, can we do this with coordinates? Can we just give you a set of latitude and longitude, and can you tell us what's there? And they started realizing that very accurately, Pat and some of their other subjects, Ingo Swann, could do this. And so around that time, CIA heard about what SRI was doing, because this was all still open in the public at that point. Small but open. And so somebody from CIA shows up at Hal Puthoff's office and says, "We'd like you to do this for us. We don't believe in it, but we're concerned because the Soviet Union is spending untold millions of dollars at 70 different laboratories around the Soviet Union, and they claim to be using this operationally. We think it's propaganda, but maybe it's not." And long story short, CIA gives coordinates to SRI. SRI gives those coordinates to Pat Price and Ingo Swann independently. Both of them, in a Faraday cage that is completely shut off from any kind of like chicanery or potential sneaking in of information, come back with the same results, which is that these coordinates are at an army base of some kind. There's giant radar dishes. There's 4 stories of underground facility. There's missile silos.
Wasn't it originally the target that was given was not the NSA facility, but it was a small like cabin.
That's right.
That was there, and that was supposed to be the target. But what I thought it was only Pat Price, but I didn't realize Ingo also targeted that facility. Actually, no, he did, but Pat Price got alphanumeric information, didn't he?
Right. It was the alphanumeric information that freaked them out the most.
They went toward the NSA facility because it was like, because the more secretive it is, the more it shines in psychic space. Isn't that how?
Favorite quote of all time. Yeah. The more you try and hide something, the more it shines like a beacon in psychic space. This is a quote from Pat Price that Russell often repeats. They gave that information to the guy from CIA. Guy from CIA looks at it and says, "This is bogus. It's like this was my buddy's cabin. I just kind of threw in there." But because there were 2 independent psychics working on it, and they both got matching data, which they often would do. They would give stuff to different people and then do a double blind thing where they would get results. That's one way they would know they were onto something. So he drives out there and he finds this facility, like a few miles away from the cabin where he had given the coordinates, and sends the data to NSA. NSA freaks out. Pretty soon FBI and his
also because Pat Price got actual program names.
That's right.
That were highly classified, and he wrote them down.
That's right. He got the names of special access projects that were current. And it was very important. This is a key point because it was important for me to confirm that these were current projects going on at the time. And to everybody who was involved recollection, these were not like old school projects that maybe somebody pulled out of a filing cabinet. These were current things that the NSA was doing to spy on the Soviet Union. And nobody should have had that information. And Pat Price just wrote it all down on a piece of paper, and they sent it over regular mail to the CIA.
Yeah, this is just mind-boggling. And by the way, you covered this really well in the documentary, so I would encourage people to go check it out. But it's an incredible story. And again, I do know that the SRI folks were investigated by, was it FBI or NSA? Like they came knocking at the door, wanting to know, how did you know this information?
I'm going to turn this into a narrative film. This is one of my goals, is to either that or an ongoing series. And it's going to be such a great scene. It's like you're pulling in the naughty high school kids into the principal's office, and they're all just sitting there like this. And the guy from, FBI or somebody just yelling at him, "How did you get this information?" And basically they said, well, we can we can show you, and we can keep doing it. And it was, and this was not a compartmentalized problem for intelligence. All of a sudden, according to Ken Kress and Kit Green, this was like a wildfire throughout the entire intelligence community. It's like, what? You mean that we could be vulnerable to this? You mean
Exactly.
maybe somebody can predict where the president's going to have lunch, or what the nuclear codes are? And so this became something that they were concerned with, and it led to a 20-year operational program, for the U.S. government. And the unfortunate byproduct of that was that a lot of this research was minimized. A lot of the data and the really good sort of work that was done at SRI is only just now, after all of these years, finally coming to light.
Well, minimized in the public, but how much in the classified world? I mean, you were just saying up to almost 3/4 of it, as of a few years ago, may still have been classified, 70%. And it really makes me think that, like, in the mid-90s, when the CIA talked about remote viewing and they really downplayed it, and this still happens to this day. Like, I've never believed that for an instant. Because when you get something that's that revolutionary, those people are very intelligent, and they know when you get hits, even if it's not 100%, it's enough that this is a very, very unique form of intelligence gathering, right? I mean, it's things that you can sometimes get no other way. So obviously they're going to treat it very, very carefully. They're going to delve deep, and maybe, just maybe, they're not really going to play it up in the public because they don't want people to know that it's a genuine capability. And a lot of these scientists at universities are, frankly, being led around by groups like the CIA, who are convincing them, no, there's nothing to this. Meanwhile, there's everything to it.
It's like I often say, it's censorship by peer pressure. I went to a conference full of PhDs, and I was filming Ed May, who was one of the that took over the program after Hal and Russell had left, and he gave me permission to shoot this talk that he was giving. And as a filmmaker, I'm always looking for B-roll and things to kind of cover up the action with. So at some point, I kind of did this. I turned the camera back around the other way, and to get a shot of the audience. And I came back around to Ed, and right away, somebody from staff comes running up and taps me on the shoulder and says, "Please don't do that again. We've gotten several complaints from people in the audience. They do not want to be filmed." And it's like they don't want to go on record. These incredible people who are in the scientific community, here to hear a man speak who also has a PhD in nuclear physics and all of this stuff, and yet they won't go on camera to talk about it because they're afraid of the stigma that comes with talking about something like ESP. It is the exact same thing. Stephen Schwartz, who was one of the pioneers of this research also, in the movie, he had a longer quote that I unfortunately had to condense, but the full quote is worth repeating. He said there's 3 major denier movements, going on in the United States. He said the first is climate change deniers, who will not admit that man-made influence could affect the climate. The second is the anti-evolutionists who refuse to admit that the world is more than a few thousand years old. And the third is the anti-consciousness movement, who will not admit that consciousness is a factor, when it comes to science. And I would actually add a fourth to that, which is the UFO phenomenon. And I think that those 4 denier movements are so key in sort of holding back innovation, and because they figured out a formula. Somebody, whoever they are, figured out this formula that you can cripple a subject matter simply by minimizing it, and by making it sound silly, and by making it a yes or no answer. It's not a binary answer.
It's an old propaganda technique,
right.
And the guys who employ it know it very, very well. I would add a couple more than just the 4 denial movements, but we could just leave it at that because there's quite a few more, I believe. Can I ask you about the UFO connection, or did you want to finish up a point? I'm sorry.
No. I'm fine. Go right ahead.
Yeah. I really want to know if you can open up a little bit with the UFO phenomenon and remote viewing. When I opened this conversation up with you a little while ago, I think I mentioned this when we were on the air, but I got into remote viewing. I got interested in it back in 2000, 2001. And it was because it occurred to me that a lot of these key remote viewers, Ingo Swann, Joe McMoneagle, Pat Price, and many others, were all having remote views in one way or another with extraterrestrials.
Mhm.
And that these were individuals who had totally solid track records of remote viewing and all sorts of things for the military, for the CIA. Here's Joe McMoneagle remote viewing the construction of a Soviet submarine back in 1979 when no one at the National Security Council believed him, including Robert Gates, who later became Secretary of Defense and later said, lucky guess.
Mhm.
Sure. So McMoneagle and Ingo was, had many, many Grand Slam home runs as a remote viewer, Pat Price, and they were all at various ways bumping into the extraterrestrial phenomenon.
Mhm.
And aside from that, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, who were organizing all of this, they definitely have an interest in this phenomenon. Hal Puthoff most recently has been a bit more open in talking about it through his connection with To the Stars Academy and the papers that he promoted through the Defense Intelligence Agency on UFO tech, basically. And this is all released. The titles came out about a month and a half ago. So there's this very definite connection. And, I guess, what am I trying to ask you here? What is it that these remote viewers are seeing? Why are they doing it? I guess is one question. Why? Could you talk about Pat Price remote viewing Alaska and a base in Alaska relating to extraterrestrials? I mean, is this something that you're able to talk about?
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's one of the reasons I wanted to be on your show. I mean, I love the grounded nature of how you talk about the UFO phenomenon. It's like there needs to be a healthy dose of reality to the UFO phenomenon that is often missing, and it makes it easy to marginalize. And
So true.
the people that you're talking about were people who were scientifically studied and proven to be very sane, very reputable, and the danger though is whenever you're dealing with issues of consciousness, your imagination is the engine and the filter of that. So it's like playing Second Life or something where you're this avatar and you're going out into the universe and you're looking at things through the filter of your mind. And I think that you're not just looking at the current reality. You could be looking at the future. You could be looking at the past, and you could also, and this is just my theory, be looking at alternate realities, or other dimensions. And there's a lot of evidence, even in Hal's papers, that this isn't really evidence, but I guess his hypothesis is that maybe the way that UFOs travel is interdimensionally. It's not just they're actually bending time and space and possibly moving through dimensions to get wherever they go. And as a remote viewer, it's very hard to delineate what you're looking at. There's no big red label that says this is the material world, this is the astral plane, this is something completely different. So I think it's easier to sort of in an esoteric sense, it would be thin the veil. You can kind of look through the veil of the reality that you're in and see other aspects of it. And Pat Price had a lot of experience with that. I mean, he was very interested in extraterrestrial cultures and things like that. And it's not an uncommon thing if you go look at the esoteric side. Like we're talking about the scientifically experimental side of all of this. There's a wealth of information on the esoteric side from everything from Edgar Casey to channelers today, who talk about the extraterrestrial phenomenon. But all of those people don't have the U.S. government to verify what they're saying. Pat Price did. Pat Price did. And so when Pat Price is doing a session about something else, which is, I believe, how this happened, Hal Puthoff told me the story, that he goes, oh, and there's UFOs here. I'm seeing craft, and I'm seeing an underground base, and I'm seeing, they fly in and out of this area all of the time, and he was able to give some details about that, and it had just crept up in another reading that Pat was doing, and Hal was curious enough about that apparently to call some government official in Alaska and inquire about that particular area. And the official responded, "Oh, you mean the area with all the UFO activity?" You know.
Yes, indeed. My understanding has always been that it was Mount Hayes in Alaska,
Mhm.
which is easy to find. It's very tall. There's a lot of there's government installations in that vicinity, and I'm going off of my own memory. What I recall learning that Pat Price said was there's an alien base there. And in fact, I'm wanting to say that he implied that it had some level of protection from the United States government from snooping people, but I could be wrong there. But then he mentioned a number of other bases. He mentioned one alien base in the Pyrenees between Spain and France,
Mhm.
and he mentioned a base in, I believe, in Zimbabwe, and then one in Australia,
Mm.
which. Now, maybe I'm getting some of this wrong, but I think he said the one in Australia was something like a Grand Central Station where a lot of them would go, and again, I wish I could remember this better, but he said I felt that they detected me, so I stopped remote viewing that one. So but his feeling was that there were a number of these alien bases that were permanent installations on planet Earth.
Yeah. Well, I think that again, let's say that you and I took a trip to the Pyrenees, and we decided to climb that whole mountain and look for some sort of entrance or some way into some sort of cavern or something like that. I don't think you'd find it. And the reason I don't think that is because I just don't think that a culture that is far more advanced than ours and understands that consciousness kind of acts as your compass in terms of where you're going to sit and which reality that you're in. You know, it's a very heady concept. It's very esoteric, but science is actually starting to point to the fact that
which reality you're in. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because that's a really big statement right there.
Well, it's an esoteric statement, but it's also a statement that science has verified. Everybody's familiar with the double slit experiment, right? You shoot a X-ray particle or something through a slit, and the scientists are sitting behind a shielded room, and they're examining where at on the plate behind the slit that particle is going to land, right? And if all of them are only looking at the left slit, every single time the particle will go to the left. If they're looking at the right, the particle goes to the right. If everybody walks out of the room and they shoot it with no human observation, then the particle actually becomes a wave, and it makes a pattern that fills the entire background.
Right.
So,
It either acts as a particle or as a wave,
right.
depending on the observer
That's right.
who is there.
It's called the observer effect, right?
Yeah.
Now let's extrapolate that out. Let's say that you and I are in a really good mood, and we expect to see UFOs, and we go to the Pyrenees, and maybe we have this amazing encounter, because our consciousness was open to that encounter. It's sort of like we got permission from the observed object to be observed. It was like, oh, okay, you can see this, that's fine. Because it's like we have a vote almost in that reality as to whether or not we are going to participate in it. It's not as like clear cut as like our everyday kind of tangible.
It took me the longest number of years, even to get to the point where I could consider what you're saying here.
Right.
Honestly,
right.
Like years ago, I was like, "That's impossible. Can't work like that. Reality doesn't bend to my wishes." That kind of thing. But I don't quite subscribe to that the way that I used to. And it's things like remote viewing, and along with the speculation and the hypotheses in physics that go along to meet it, that have really made me think twice about that attitude that I had.
Well, from a more generic perspective, this is like we're talking about the law of attraction, right? I mean, we're talking about like, gee, I really want that red car, and then all of a sudden you start seeing red cars everywhere, or it's like, how much of reality are you creating, and how much of it are you sort of a victim of? I mean, Einstein asked that question. Einstein said, the biggest question we can ask is, do we choose to live in a universe that is friendly, or do we choose to live in a universe where we are helpless, to the forces around us? And it's kind of a combination of both, because I do believe, and I think that, like you said, it took you a long time to come to that. So did I.
Mhm.
But I think it's only something that you can come to through personal experience, because it is personal. It's like, if we're going to get really esoteric from it and say, okay, the universe is this infinite place. It just goes on and on and on, and it's as big as you can possibly imagine it, because consciousness plays into how big it even is. If just for hypothesis purposes, we say that's the truth, then if it's infinite, then your point of consciousness is sitting right in the middle of it, because you're sitting right in the middle of it. So it's like you're this sort of center in the eye of the storm of consciousness. So your own attitudes, your own belief system, your own observations are constantly changing it. And which would explain why, since forever, psychics have been predicting, huge disasters, the end of the world. Like, somebody goes on Coast to Coast and says the giant comet is about to kill us all, and it does.
Right.
And even if these are people who are, who in the past have been correct on some things, even people like Edgar Cayce, who's the most documented psychic in the history of the world, he predicted a lot of, like, traumatic things in the future. But it's kind of like our own consciousness guides us towards what we're observing, or even just the act of observing something in the future changes it, in a sense. It gives you a vote in how it goes down. And I think that there's evidence that,
Are you suggesting, I want to make sure, that when people make predictions about disasters, that the very act of prediction is what helps to avert the disaster?
yes, that's what I'm
You are
suggesting.
saying that.
I'm saying that when a whole bunch of people read Nostradamus's prediction about some dire outcome,
Mhm.
and and they all kind of look at it and they don't get real freaked out, that the universe just kind of does this little ripple, and then everything just goes right on along. Like, there's, like, for instance,
I just thought that they were wrong. That's all. That was my
they're,
assumption.
they're wrong, but if it's like, it's a model of the universe that I think science hasn't really latched onto yet, is
Mhm.
this idea of holographic universe theory, right? Like fractals. I talked to Dean Radin a little bit about this, and Dean Radin is in our film. He's one of the preeminent parapsychologists working today at Institute of Noetic Sciences, and Dean was saying that if Ingo Swann can look out and see ice rings around Jupiter before any human has ever observed it, what it suggests is that information was probably already there in his awareness before anyone knew it. It was just, he has access to the entire matrix, that we're sort of in here. So if that's possible, then it's like he has this complete, hard drive copy that can be altered of reality. So maybe there's another version of reality where he didn't. I mean, it gets really crazy, and
It does. It is absolutely mind bending, and I didn't want to sound flippant about what I just said. I mean, it's a hard concept, honestly, for me to come to terms with. That is, the very act of making a prediction will change the outcome.
um,
I mean, honestly, why wouldn't that be the case?
well,
It's like our own version of a double slit experiment, I suppose, right?
well, let's make it a lot more mundane. Let's say that you go to a tarot card reader, and
Mhm.
the tarot card reader says, "Oh, you're going to be in a horrible accident." Like, "Oh, you're not doing well." And then you walk out of there a lot more carefully, and you
Sure.
don't. Yeah, you're not going to get into the accident. You probably you've changed the outcome. You know, um, it's a heady concept, and I'm just totally riffing. I mean, I'm not a scientist, so don't take me at my word. But it's something that, if we're going to believe that the observer effect is real, and if we're going to believe that consciousness is primary, as Max Planck, the famous
Mhm.
philosopher said, then everything is springing from consciousness. Even the act of having a universe is because you have consciousness, because if the tree falls in the forest, it doesn't make a sound unless you're there to actually observe it. So the idea of the UFO phenomenon, it may be that maybe we've been going all about this wrong. Like we've got SETI, and they're out there looking at radio waves from other planets, and that would be like the most primitive way of communication that you could possibly imagine, when you take into account that there is such a thing as consciousness existing outside of your own brain. Because then let's move this forward 10,000 years, and now we're all a culture on this planet who accepts the data and accepts the fact that this is real, and it has gotten good at using it. Then it really is a really good communication system at that point, potentially.
I have a friend and a colleague named Gordon White. I did an interview with Gordon earlier in 2018, and it was a really enlightening conversation, because he introduced an idea to me that I hadn't considered, which was that if you go to the idea of ancient contact, ancient aliens, he said, why wouldn't it be that ancient people, instead of having direct contact with extraterrestrials that would have come to Earth and teach us the ways of this or that, could it just be that they had advanced what we would call telepathic or high level of consciousness connection with these other intelligences? In a lot of ways, that would make more sense. And my own take on that, by the way, is that people 10,000 plus years ago had a larger brain, like 10 to 15% larger than what we have. It would be as if someone took an ice cream scoop out of their brain, and you end up then with our brain. That's exactly what happened. And so what was that brain used for? Well, it could quite possibly be, what is it that requires survival in a hunting gathering environment? You have to have total connection with your environment in every way. And it could, I've often wondered, like, it could very well be that one of the things that they had that was really amped up was this psi ability. And Gordon just put this idea out that it could very well be that what we call the ancient alien phenomenon is a purely psychic connection that we had.
I think that everybody talks about the idea of disclosure, and when are they going to land on the White House lawn? How come they don't just come down and say hello? I've had this debate many times with people over the years, and I would argue that contact's long been made, and it happens every single time that somebody gets a creative idea or a new innovation or a new thought. I think that consciousness, the evidence of remote viewing points to the fact that consciousness is viral. Like if you talk.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by viral? I would love to hear you talk about this.
I'll tell a story about Lori Williams. Have you ever had Lori Williams on the show?
No.
Lori Williams is in the movie. She's the one that was teaching she was teaching a group of Russians how to do remote viewing in the movie.
Oh yes, yes.
Yeah, she is a well-respected remote viewing instructor. She learned from Lynn Buchanan, who was one of the Army remote viewers. And her philosophy about remote viewing when she teaches a student is that she's got like probably 60 different targets that she uses. And she'll use those same targets again and again in different classes. And there's a reason for it. Because when a different student has nailed a target, maybe like a year earlier, and a new student gets that same target, the fact that it's already been looked at psychically, the fact that someone already got it right and has thought about this, the consciousness that has been placed on that target makes it easier for someone else to see. It's like the 100th monkey. Like the 100th monkey effect, where scientists are studying a group of monkeys on an island, and a few monkeys learn how to use a stick to get something out of a hole, and then all of the other monkeys around it learn how to do that. And then for some reason, around the time about 100 monkeys figure out how to use the tool, every monkey in the entire species across this whole island chain, that's not directly connected to that one group, now knows how to do that.
I've heard this. Is this really true? Is this actually a thing?
It is, yeah. I was just listening to a podcast, Joe Rogan's podcast, and he had a scientist from the UK on, and his name escapes me at the time, saying that this phenomenon has been studied and repeated in experiments in Britain, there's a particular kind of like blue jay or some kind of bird that lives in England, and it would fly down and get the cream out of the milk at the in the bottles. Like when the milkman would leave it, it knew how to peck the top and somehow open it up and get the cream out. And once a small population of the birds in one area started doing this, then all of a sudden the birds all over the island of England, were reported doing it. Because one bird figured it out. There's a scientist here in the United States. His name is Adam Curry. He's another great guy that I just recently met through the film, and he has done experiments with raccoons. He'll put a sort of like a box out in a yard, and when the raccoon does a certain couple of things in the right order, it figures out how to open up the box, and he figured out that I might be completely slaughtering his experiment, but I think this is what it was. He figured out then that after a while, all of the raccoons in the area just knew to come up to the box and do the certain series of events to get the food out. So this is something that you see in nature. You can even look at the 6 Minute Mile. Like let's talk about the 6 Minute Mile. Nobody breaks the 6 Minute Mile for years. One runner,
the 4-minute mile.
What is it now? Is it? I think
now they're way below 4. But for a long time in the 20th century, it was like no one can make a 4-minute mile. It's impossible.
Yeah, right. And then one guy does it, and then it becomes okay. And then all of a sudden, other people can do it. You could say the same thing about Stanford Research Institute and in the film, the work that they were doing there. Multiple people, like Charlie Tart, Russell, Hal, several people attributed the success that they had at SRI to the fact that basically they were just able to give permission to people to be psychic. And there were people that came through there and were very psychic that had never done it before. And that sort of just made it okay. And then everybody believed they could do it. And then they just did it really well.
Yeah. It's like consciousness has its own, it's like a Wi-Fi, right? One of Ingo's books, he did 2 volumes. It was supposed to be 3 volumes, and I don't think he ever did the third. Secrets of the Super Bio Mind, some kind of title like that. And I have the books, and it's kind of tough going, I have to be honest. I mean, his writing style was a little arcane in my opinion, but he had a couple of very cool ideas. And one of the ideas was like this psi ability. Like he was saying exactly what you're saying. Like everyone's got it. Mm-hmm. Everyone's got it. And he says, in fact, why do we have it? He says, we must have it because we need it. We wouldn't have it if we didn't need it, if it didn't provide a benefit to us. And he kind of went on about a whole theory as to like why that was so, but he was very, very strongly of the opinion that this was an innate quality that all human beings were gifted with. Some were really amazing at it, of course, and others not as much, but everyone's got some.
2,000 years ago, in the time of Christ, the Yoga Sutras were written. There was Russell may have mentioned this already, I don't know, but there was Patanjali, I think was his name, wrote the Yoga Sutras in the Hindu religion about the process of enlightenment, and one of the chapters in the Yoga Sutras, some of the stanzas that are there, talk about the fact that as you go on your path of enlightenment and as you learn to meditate and do these other things, that you will start to experience some odd things. You may see other places distant in time and space. You may get impressions of people that are far away. You may be able to find objects that are very small at a distance. He basically just completely describes remote viewing 2,000 years ago. So this is not a
wow
phenomenon. It's not something that Ingo Swann just developed in a lab. It's something, like you say, like it's something that's been around forever. Why is it that you can go to a Native American medicine man and they'll know just the right herbs, to mix, that they've mixed for thousands of years to, get rid of some illness that you have or whatever, how'd they get that information? If you go to the Amazon and they know just the right herbs to fix something, most likely because at some point somebody got the idea in their head that if I mix these 2 herbs together, it's going to work, and I think that that's the way, when I say consciousness is viral, that's what I mean. It's like the first guy, the first Indian, 10,000, or not Indian, the first Native American 10,000 years ago that took those herbs and put them together, how do we know he wasn't actually looking at someone else 10,000 years in the future doing it, and he pulled it back? It's very mind bending.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually agree with all of this. And again, I have to struggle because I'm literally of two minds about this. Like, I've got my very materialistic, I'll be the first to admit it, reliance on what I would consider to be evidence. What can I work with? What can I defend, particularly in a public venue? And also, knowing that remote viewing, there's obviously something to it, but it's not exact. Like, remote viewers get things wrong.
Oh yeah.
And aside from even that, they'll misinterpret things. And it's like being a really good athlete. Tracy, my wife, has described this to me a number of times. She'll say, like, you can get on like a hitting streak, like a baseball player, and then you go on a cold streak because you can psych yourself out. So it's not a 100% like, oh, I can do it all the time. It doesn't work like that. So for me, when some random person will tell me that, oh, I remote viewed such and such a thing, and I get that all the time from people who want to tell me what they've remote viewed or what they've intuited. And I never really know how to take it, because I know from my own experience, some people really are genuine and others really aren't. And it's difficult. People like to talk about discernment these days. And for me, I just think, yeah, you got to be discerning, because you can't just go on what someone says that they've remote viewed. And that's the problem with it, from my point of view. Like, I want to be able to know how to use genuine remote viewed or psychic information. But from my point of view, there's just so much that I just have to throw away because it's not valid.
Yeah.
That makes it difficult. That's the problem.
Well, the problem is your own subconscious and your own imagination. Like, that's the problem, is because you're dealing with something that is inherently unstable, which is our own thoughts. Like, our thoughts wander, they go different places. And there's tools that have been developed by first the Army, then Lori Williams, and some of the other Army guys who get around that in their remote viewing work. But you're never going to be able to get 100% accuracy, because not even Pat Price was getting 100%. Ken Kress,
no, right.
Tell me that, Pat would come in with these really great details of a few things, and then he'd throw in a bunch of junk on top of that, and it was either unprovable or wrong. So how do you get around that? But when it comes to intelligence and the intelligence community, human intelligence, is inherently not always right. They know there's a margin of error. They have intelligence assets all over the place that are unreliable, but it's the conglomeration of all of the different intelligence assets. Joe McMoneagle and the Army remote viewers were given nothing but cold cases, stuff that nobody else could solve. They solved 20% of those cases. And that's amazing, because
that is amazing.
Solve those. Right. And but it was probably because they would add seasoning to the mix about what was known about whatever it was that was looking at, that then all of that other data that is sitting in a computer somewhere could then be accessed to fill out the rest of it. So it's not working in a vacuum. So when they say, oh, nothing was ever done with remote viewing and it was just operationally not successful, did the remote viewer go out there himself and go catch the guy and know exactly the street address to go to? No, but they did know a lot of the other details that got somebody.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think when it, to go back to UFOs for a minute. Oops.
This is the age we live in.
I thought that was off. Sorry. To go back to UFOs for a minute, I think that the idea of contact is very personal, because if we think that consciousness has an effect outside of our own minds, then it can travel anywhere, even to another planet. One of the things I'm going to be doing in my next project is I'm going to work with UFO summoners. you know, like there are groups of people who will go out to a location known for UFOs, and they'll
Right.
do a meditation or something, and basically using their own imaginations, you know, they project a path to contact a UFO,
Yes,
and they,
indeed. Yeah.
you know, like I actually went on one, and I mean, I had night vision set up everywhere. I had, you know, many different cameras. Turns out the most useful one I had was just my iPhone, you know, shooting in 4K with a night vision goggle attached, and I was literally on a break, and I'm walking around with this thing, and I'm looking through the lens, and I was actually looking at something else. I was checking something with the night vision, and I turn the camera like this, and a light pops on right in front of the camera that I can't see with my naked eye, but something pops on like in the grass and just goes and out, you know,
Hmm.
and I was like, what the heck is that? You know, I don't have no idea what it was, but it was as if when I hit the camera over, I was turning the camera, it knew that it had been filmed, and then it just took off. You know, so what is that? I don't know. I can't
Yeah.
explain it, but
I've known people who have an uncanny knack for being able to see and at times photograph anomalous objects in the sky. And like they can't explain it. I can't explain it. I do believe that there's something, definitely something there.
you know,
And it's our consciousness. There is this connection
that's right.
that our minds have. I mean, I've had two very mundane UFO sightings in my life, but on both occasions, I've said this before, I felt strongly
Mhm,
that that object was somehow getting into my head.
mhm.
And I'll always believe that. I don't know for sure. So, and then again and again in the research of the UFO phenomenon, uh, this is what you hear witnesses saying over and over again. Uh, they'll describe this feeling that this object was responding to their thoughts or getting into their head in some way or another. And you hear it almost so often, it's almost a cliche,
Yeah.
but there's clearly something going on there. And this is an interesting connection with remote viewing and psi phenomenon and UFOs in general. And, you know, we're not the first people to talk about this. This is a very, very widespread popular subject these days. And I've not always found all of it compelling, but I keep coming back to say there is something there. There's absolutely something there.
There must be,
Yeah.
because um, years ago, many years ago, when I've always been interested in the extraterrestrial subject. You know, like since I was a child, like, you know, I would read comics and books about it and stuff like that, and it used to scare me when I was a kid. You know, because I thought, oh, I don't want to get picked up in the middle of the night or something. You know, but
Hmm.
at a certain point in my life, I sort of had evolved my way of thinking enough to kind of go, you know, I don't think that you can be an advanced culture and not completely obliterate yourselves about the level of culture that we have now. Like, you know, it was actually my own thoughts about nuclear weapons that I was thinking about at the time. You know, we're not going to make it another 100 years if we don't get out of our own way and stop considering ourselves to be just completely victims and completely separate from each other. And the way around that is consciousness, you know, and so a society that is an advanced society that actually has weapons or lack of weapons, you know, that technology basically that is light years ahead of ours, um, wouldn't have it unless they had figured out both a sort of spiritual side to themselves, you know, you know, the fact that they're connected to the rest of the universe in some way, and we don't have that right now. You know, so it's like, I think that the fact that we have not figured that out is truly like the biggest reason why you don't have open contact with societies beyond our own planet.
Well, I'll accept what you're saying. I don't really think that I agree with that, to be honest with you. I'm
Oh,
not sure that it's impossible that an advanced species can't be some version of interstellar economic hitmen, to use a different phrase on it. I think it's entirely possible that an advanced species can be rapacious and can be on a lower level of consciousness. I think is entirely possible. Having said that, I wouldn't discount what you're saying on it either. I just think that there's a couple of different possibilities there personally.
I would put it like this: the same way that you can have a society now that has, you know, serial killers and, you know, very obviously not good people, But those are the outliers. Like they're not, they would not be the norm. Because at a certain point, your technology just gets so great that if you mess with anybody, you're going to just destroy the whole thing. Weapons would just be so terrible. And I think that if you talk to experiencers like you're talking about, like people who have seen stuff, if you interview those kinds of folks, if you look at some of the more esoteric texts and stuff, a lot of those people are talking about a consciousness connection, the same kind of connection that a remote viewer would have, looking at a target, which is why I think remote viewers are constantly stumbling across, ET stuff. You hear them all talk about it, like you say, is because the field is already really crowded. When it comes to consciousness, there's consciousness that's got to be out there. We would be naive to think that we're all alone at this point. I mean,
well, since we're going full woo here, let me continue this. By the way, I've kept you way beyond what I was supposed to do, but if you don't mind, let's just keep going.
Mm-hmm.
This is all anecdotal, but for 20 years, I've spoken to people who will say like the following. Started meditating on a regular basis at such and such a time, and then I had fill in the blank experience, ET experience, out of body experience, whatever, but often an encounter with another intelligence. And it's too often connected to meditation and some, whatever discipline someone's going through with, like focusing their mind. And I've often just speculated that, if you've got highly telepathic or intellectually or let even say spiritually advanced other beings that are observing us, they will find those people the most interesting. Like if you're looking around on planet Earth at all these human beings running around, most people just looking at the ground and doing their very, very mundane tasks. But then a few people are actually exploring and trying to open their head. Well, they're the ones that'll be noticed. And I've simply speculated that this is part of what's going on. What do you think about that?
I think to an extent, I think you're right. And we're just totally speculating. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I've just looked at a lot of the data and I've talked to a lot of these people. And it's not so much that person would be the most interesting. Kind of like walking around in a room with everybody focused completely on their cell phones, and you can't start a conversation with anybody because they're preoccupied.
Yeah, exactly.
You
want to talk to those people, like they're boring.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing to talk about. You're looking at, Kim Kardashian on your phone, and I can't get your attention to even have a conversation. But the way that you see things like innovations happen, the way innovations will pop up all over the planet at the same time, everything from the Wright brothers to the invention of the radio, on down the line, it's kind of like, the signals are just out there waiting to be picked up. Joe McMoneagle, the best Army remote viewer, I don't know if he was the best, but the most well-known for sure. He gave a talk on MUFON. Have you seen the talk that he gave to MUFON?
Yes. In fact, I heard you reference it in another interview, and it was from 2004. And he was talking about remote viewing UFOs or ET, wasn't he?
That's right. He said that there were times that someone would bring him a satellite photo or some other evidence of a UFO sighting somewhere, and they would say, "What do you think about this?" And he would, sketch it out. And he said they were often interested in the propulsion systems. How does the propulsion system work? And he would, draw out stuff, and he'd have no idea what he was even describing. He was, because again, Russell Targ's mantra is you don't label it, you just throw it out there,
right.
And then they would walk away, and he would never know what the result is, and Joe also said in that same talk that he had a suspicion that during sidereal time, like the time that the planet, I think, is facing the outer edge of the galaxy. I may be wrong about that, but I think that's what it is. Are you familiar with sidereal time?
Yeah, I thought it had something to do with because the Earth is spinning, it's rotating as it's revolving around the sun. So those two motions are involved in tracking sidereal time. Honestly, no, I'm not going to pretend. I can't remember.
There's a certain time of the planetary day when it's been shown that psychic abilities are perhaps easier to access.
Should look this up.
Like in ancient times, they would say it was the witching hour. It's like,
All right.
and James Spottiswoode did a lot of work on this. He's a scholar and a mathematician who looks at statistics and stuff. And Joe quoted him in this talk that he gave to MUFON, saying that he believed that at that time of the day, it was possible that we were facing an area of the galaxy that was more densely populated, with other consciousness beyond our own. And,
Okay.
and that somehow the fact that there was more consciousness accessible at that particular time made it easier to access psychic information at that time. Now maybe not. It's a theory, but it ties into the theory of the fact that the more you look at a target, for example, like in Lori Williams's class, you're looking at this same target that other students have looked at before. There's a lot of consciousness focused on something, or the way that like many people would say they had precognitive dreams and things like that about 9/11. Whenever there's a big, huge splash in psychic space, and a lot of people focus on it, it makes it easier to see.
Disturbance in the force.
Right. Exactly. And that same disturbance in the force. Here's my other sort of like completely layman's theory on that, is that when there is a lot of consciousness that's incoherent, a lot of like panic going on, a war starts, like something like that. Let's just extrapolate that to if you were an extraterrestrial culture who understood the value of your own consciousness and was able to use it. That would be like a disturbance in the force where 1,000 voices all crying out at the same time, or whatever. It's like, it would be like as if your neighbor is playing really loud rock music and you just don't want to be anywhere near it. Because we're just noisy as a species. It's like we don't know how to control or maintain our own thoughts, and so if you were somebody that could really be very sensitive to that, then you would not really want anything to do with that planet until they got their act together.
Yeah, I honestly, I'm very impressed by the directions that you've gone with this. And before we had this conversation, I didn't really know that we would be discussing some of these items, and I'm really glad that we have, because whenever I talk with someone who's really deep into consciousness studies, I have to say it always challenges me, and I need to be challenged. Like, I'll be the first to admit it. I'm married to a really good remote viewer, so I know that there's something quite valid to this, and I know that it forces me to challenge what I have come to understand about time, about space, about consciousness, about what this universe is. And I can tell, like, I'm still on my own little path here, and I don't know where I'm going to be in another 5, 10, 20 years. Hopefully in a more interesting place than I currently am. I'm in a more interesting place now than I was 10 years ago and 20 years ago. So it keeps getting better. So that's good news. Before we wrap this segment up, I wonder, by the way, I want to thank you just for being willing to go extra long here with me.
Oh, no.
I'd planned just to do this for an hour with you, and you've been wonderful. We hadn't really planned on talking about this, but I really want to know what you think about remote influencing. If this is a thing. Well, also, actually, I want to finish up one thing on the UFO part.
Mm-hmm.
So you have Joe McMoneagle talking about being tasked to view UFOs.
Mm-hmm.
And, people like Hal Puthoff and Russell, they're very cagey about the UFO remote viewing connection. Like, they just are.
Sure.
And yet that connection is there. It's been there. It never goes away. They're both into UFOs. They're both very interested in that phenomenon. All the people that they've worked with are into it. I think it's a fair assessment to say that UFOs and extraterrestrials are kind of a given for that whole crowd. Like, it's not even an open question. And but here's the thing. Like, officially speaking, all of these folks will say, well, no, we don't task anyone to look for extraterrestrials. They do that on their own time.
Right.
But is that really the case? What did you learn anything in going into this? Is this just a convenient fiction that they like to put out there for deniability, or do you have your own off the record opinion? Since you're not CIA, so you can say whatever you want about this.
Well, it was always sort of an interest that I had on my own, and you know, trying to wrangle a lot of the people that are in our movie, which I will say, by the way, is available in worldwide. I have to just plug that. You know, like
Oh, you know, do it,
now,
yeah.
the movie is now out. It's number 4, I believe, on iTunes. You can order it, you know, today. But trying to wrangle all of these different people was difficult, and two of the most difficult actually to get on camera, not because they didn't really want to do it, but because they're just busy. Was Hal and Kit Green, you know, who is still a medical doctor in Detroit, and many times I would say to Kit, like, you know, hey, can I interview you? And, you know, can I fly out there to see you? No, I'm much too busy. I'm going to be down in Austin with Hal this whole week, and you know, we're just doing all this work, and I can't you know, get together. And I would say, well, what are you working on? I can't talk about that. You can't talk about that. You know.
Oh, there's a bunch of people who talk about that. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to hear or not, but I think there's a lot of talk circulating around about exactly what they're doing.
Well, I heard a lot of that talk. You know, I
Yeah.
heard about this talk not from them, but from other people that were around them. You know, a lot of people don't know that Hal runs a laboratory in Austin, which is why he left, you know, the remote viewing program in the '80s to study free energy. You know, he basically will look at anybody's free energy device that wants to bring it in, and if it works, then, you know, they'll experiment with it. If it doesn't work, he lets them know. He told me that in the last, you know, history of his, you know, work there, that they have never found energy from the vacuum. You know, he writes lots of papers about how it is theoretically possible and this kind of thing, but no one's ever had a working free energy device.
Well, he talked about the Casimir effect, which I think was from the 1990s. So supposedly, from what little I understand, that proves that there is some 0 point energy, which is simply energy at 0 point Kelvin.
Hmm.
So there's no thermal energy, but there's still energy.
Right.
But the real question is it a lot of energy or
Mhm.
a tiny amount, insignificant amount of energy? I think that's the big question. And to my knowledge, I don't know if he ever answered that.
Um, and Kit, when you, but I knew Hal was very interested in this UFO phenomenon, and Kit, in early conversations we had many different conversations prior to our actual interview, just on background and just trying to get to know each other so that he would be comfortable doing the interview, and you know, he didn't come to me saying, "Oh, I'm very interested in the UFO subject." You know, he talked about it a lot, but he talks about it in a way almost to say that this is not an area of serious scientific study, because just like with remote viewing, you can't come up with a working hypothesis as to what it really is. It's really interesting, but we don't know what it is, and so you can't put your finger on it scientifically. That was his take. You know,
Yeah, I would throw money down that they both know exactly what's going on.
no comment. I don't know, but yes, you know, I would, as an opinion, yeah. You know, I mean, I had lunch with Kit, and we were in the lunch line together, and he was saying something about Hal, and he said, "Oh, you're lucky to get Hal, because Hal's like really busy. Like, you know, we're doing a lot of stuff." And I said, "So, well, what are you doing?" And he's like, "I can't talk about it." You know, and he just, like, you know, kept eating his mind.
Yeah.
And I think that when you go into Kit's office, for instance, you know, I went into his office. He's got this giant blow up of a crop circle over his desk. You know,
Oh, really?
yeah. You know,
Yeah.
so there's interest there, and then now if you go on the To the Stars Academy website, which Hal is involved with, which kind of took over some of the work from you know, the ATIP program that the Pentagon was doing and all of this.
Mhm.
If you go on the website, there's a video of Hal talking about how he got involved, and he says, "Well, my good friend, you know, Kit Green, you know, invited me to be a part of the project, so that's why I got involved." You know, and so there is some sort of connection there. You know, whether it's a hobby of theirs, I can't say, but I can say that I think that they take it very seriously, and Hal has written some really interesting papers on stuff like anti-gravity, the fact that the way that UFOs could move from one point to another using gravity and bending time and space that way.
Exactly. He gave a very, very excellent talk on this at the SSE, Society for Scientific Exploration meeting last June of 2018, and it's on Vimeo, and I would highly recommend it to people to watch.
I'm going to go see that, I think that nowadays, I believe that a lot of the classified work that was being done is not housed in any agency. It's not like the CIA is now the home of remote viewers, or the NSA, or any other agency that we've ever heard of. I believe that it's all happening the way it started at SRI, through contractors. And a lot of these contractors probably have no idea if they would be remote viewing something classified. If they get a phone call, saying, I really want to remote view the backside of the moon. I just think it would be fun to do. Can you please send me, your data on that? And they did this to 10 different corporations. There's a lot out there, that are using remote viewing for things like product development. Like Joe McMoneagle now works for corporations looking at trends in the future. He predicted ebooks, like way before ebooks were going to be a big thing. Things like that. So there's companies out there that are on the down low that are using remote viewing. If they get tasked looking at an ET thing, they have no idea if it's classified or not. Like nobody else knows that they're remote viewing this, and they have no way of proving that data. So
right, that's the thing.
All that somebody from CIA or another agency would have to do is just send that remote viewer a few other tasks first to make sure that they were credible, like kind of demonstration of ability tests. And once they had enough sort of evidence that they were credible, then they could send them whatever crazy thing they want to send them. And then that person never knows if it was classified or not. So
all right. So look, before we wrap this section up, because we're going a really long time, can I ask you, I would like to ask you about remote influencing, and have you learned anything? So in other words, the ability, at least the theoretical ability, to affect things remotely.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there's even things as dramatic as supposedly remote killing.
Mm-hmm.
They talked about the men who stare at goats, and that was the theme. And is this type of thing possible in your research into this? And what is there anything about this that you can say?
Well, I was just doing a show with Brett Stewart, who's another remote viewing instructor, last night, and he was telling a story about how they were doing a remote viewing experiment at IRVA, the International Remote Viewers Association, a group experiment, and somebody tried a remote influence idea there, where they just sat in the audience and thought squirrel, 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 and then when the experiment was over, one lady got up and said, I just kept picturing the squirrel. I don't know why,
Wow.
So is it possible? Yes. Is it useful? I think it's a lot harder to do than remote viewing. I think that anything that involves two people is a two-way street. It's kind of like the person who has a voodoo doll, and I have this voodoo doll of Richard Dolan, and I'm going to put a pin right here, and I'm going to make it really hurt for you.
It's been done. You wouldn't be the first.
I'm sure, but I'm sure there's about 12 voodoo dolls waiting for me here. But the point to that is that if you don't believe it, then it has no power over you, right? I mean, it's like you're. I think that belief has a real play in that. Like if you sort of believe that you're very susceptible to something like that, it might amplify the effect even just psychologically. Now,
what about a team of remote view? I mean, I don't even really know if this happens, but you could have a team of very good people who focus on one target. Mm-hmm. Could they, if you got like 12 of them, could they affect that person in ways that person's not expecting or aware of?
There's an experiment in our film that was brought to light by Larissa Velenskaya, who I just used archival footage of her, but she passed away. But she was the KGB operative that was in charge of monitoring Stanford Research Institute from Moscow, and so she was sending assets out, following what SRI was doing, and she at one point went to the United States and she defected. and she showed up at SRI and said, "Hey, I know you guys really well. I'm looking to defect, and I want to work with you." And they took her in. She went to work for actually Dale Graff at DIA, who knew her very well. And one of the stories that she told actually on camera, and we do feature it in the film, is this idea of remote influence experiment that they did in the Soviet Union, where they had someone hundreds of miles away focus on another subject and strangle that person, and instantly the person that was miles away developed shortness of breath and couldn't breathe and almost passed out, and they actually had to terminate the experiment. And so that suggests, at least according to her, that something like that is possible. Now, what I don't know is, did they tell that person that was thousands of miles away or 100 miles away or whatever, that this experiment was going on and that this could happen? And could it be like a hypnotic suggestion almost?
Right. Okay.
I mean, that's possible. I do think that, I mean, it's proven that if you can hypnotize somebody, you can certainly influence them. You can get somebody to stop smoking. You can do all kinds of things. And then we extrapolate that out, that consciousness can actually affect at a distance. You can get the outgoing information. Can you put ingoing information in as well? That's a really interesting question. The Soviets were much more interested in the latter. Like they were much more interested in remote influence, in all of that. The Americans were much more interested in the outbound, information, like just the gathering of intel, and that was highly successful. And when I've talked to pretty much everybody that we interviewed that might have known, they've said that the Soviets never really got anywhere, with the whole remote influence thing. It was much harder.
Yeah, I could see it being very difficult. And by the way, it would just seem to me logical. Like there's ancient wisdom on this topic. People, Stoics like Marcus Aurelius and other philosophers who would say, look, you control your mind, you discipline your mind. If you have a well-ordered mind, nothing can affect you. Bingo. And I actually believe that. Like, I think that, we have the ability to strengthen our mind and our method of perception and how we think. And that could be a very good defense. I would like to think, anyway, against an attack like that.
Me too. I agree 100%, and I'm so glad that you actually brought that up, because my goal with my film was not to scare anybody or say, the government's now watching you with psychics or something like that, because I don't believe that, and I don't believe that the ability works that way. And I also am a huge subscriber to the fact that you're absolutely right, that the more you can sort of discipline your own mind, grounded in this sort of material reality, the less susceptible to anything you are. I mean, it's like it's all about being balanced. It's like the danger in remote viewing, and Kit Green talked at length about this, and I wasn't able to. I put it in the film a little bit, but not a lot. He talked about how remote viewing can actually be very detrimental if you lose your grip on where you're standing. I mean, if all of a sudden your mind is just operating out in the universe all the time, whether you're looking at UFOs or you're just trying to find your car keys, you're not paying attention to the road. You're not paying attention to paying your bills. You can become unbalanced. And I think we need to be really careful, in how we talk about this phenomenon, because you don't want people to use it as escapism.
No, totally. I mean, that's a fascinating subject, like all of that stuff that's beyond this reality that we normally deal with. But right, it's a seduction. And meanwhile, you can lose your eyes are off the prize.
Right.
And the prize, in my view, is however you want to think of it. Like, you could say, well, I've had multiple incarnations, or I'm a spiritual being having a physical experience. Well, that's right. You're having a physical experience, man. And don't blow it.
Right.
Don't blow it.
Right. A very good friend of mine named Dennis George Rudolph, who's he's a very knowledgeable, historian of philosophical subjects. And he says, he has a saying: before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water.
Exactly.
It's like we still have to live here. The UFO is not going to come, guys, and like zoom us up and then we get to escape this whole thing. It's like, the planet is here. You're standing on it. Like, we still have to exist and function. And the best way to do that with remote viewing is with moderation. It's with a set and setting that is appropriate. Like you wouldn't go take acid at a at a riot, and expect to have a good experience. I mean, you have to be in a balanced situation and a balanced individual. And they actually found through the remote viewing programs, the best remote viewers were the most boring people. Like the very sane, rational, highly successful people in other disciplines were the remote viewers that did the best job. Like the crazy psychic with the turban and the crystal ball.
Did not do as well, you're saying?
Yeah, for a candle. Yeah, they're not the best remote viewers. The people who were extroverted maybe in some ways, who were just considered pleasant, interesting people, whatever, and were maybe really good at something else. Was who they looked for when they wanted to find remote viewers.
Good to know. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Well, look, I think I'd like to wrap this up with you soon, if you don't mind.
Sure.
When we do this, I'd like to do a second segment for Richard Dolan members, and I would just love to have you talk about some of the things that you left out of Third Eye Spies, because you were saying like you did a huge amount of research on this, and I know that you had to leave a lot of things out that were actually quite amazing.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I'm building up my YouTube channel now. Which is youtube.com Waking Universe TV. Is the YouTube channel, or you can find it under my name. Yeah. And because there's so much stuff left on the table. Even like major things like how they closed the program, and some things that were done by college kids that led generals to question a multi-billion-dollar program they were doing at the time, through a remote viewing experiment with Charlie Tart, which we can talk about in the next.
Absolutely. Yeah. I want to get into a little bit.
And those things were just left off the table. And I was going, oh man, it's like, what do I do? It's like, I have so much material, and a lot of that will start appearing on my my YouTube channel. I'll be slowly cutting a lot of that and putting it out.
What is Lance? What is your YouTube channel? So we're gonna have links below, but what is your channel, if you can just tell people?
YouTube.com Waking Universe TV, or you can just type my name into YouTube and it will come up. Lance
Mungia. Everyone. And Third Eye Spies. By the way, there is a website. Is it just thirdeyespies.com, I think, or?
Right. thirdeyespies.com. You can put your email address in, and you'll get like some of the bonus stuff that I'm putting out. You can also find the links there for iTunes and for Amazon. But the main thing is go to Amazon or go to iTunes right now. And if you haven't seen the film, please see the film. And if you have seen the film and you enjoyed it, please leave us a review. It's super important for people who don't know anything about this subject matter, when they find the film, that there are other people who have enjoyed the experience. I mean, it's going to really help us get this information out much more widely. And I feel like we are sort of custodians of history at this point, and it's really super important that people see this film.
I fully agree. And having seen the film, I'm not affiliated with the project in any way. I just want people to know this. I thought it was very excellent and so important in that you created this record for posterity. Russell and Hal are both in their 80s. And a lot of the other people associated with this program are very, very advanced in their years. And we're not all going to be here forever. So there will be a time when this is going to be like one of the primary records that is left behind of this extraordinary program. And it's a really important part of our history. And you've captured it really, really well. And I certainly commend you for that.
Thank you, Richard. And one of the reasons I was so eager to do this interview was because I'd gotten an email, I think it was from your wife, saying, look, we really want to help you preserve this, for history. We're so glad you guys are doing this, in terms of, putting the record out for this. And the biggest fear, I think, that Russell Targ has had most of his life is that all of this really beautiful work and research and thought that has been put into the subject matter may just be lost to the dustbins in some archive somewhere, and nobody believes it, and that was my biggest fear was, oh my gosh, what if the film comes out and nobody even sees this? And I just spent 5 years and not getting paid and working on this thing, in complete isolation. And I did that because I believed so much that regardless of what you think of the evidence, the history of this needs to be preserved and for future generations. So that's why we did it.
Yeah, and on that, well done indeed. So with that, how about we wrap up this segment of the interview, my interview here with Lance Mungia, and he is the director and editor of Third Eye Spies, and really the force behind this excellent film. Links are below, and I would definitely encourage everyone to check that out. If you want to hear Lance and us continue our conversation, go to my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where we're going to go even further. And I definitely want to talk about some of the stuff that hit the cutting floor. And my own take on that is, just because it hit the cutting floor doesn't mean it's less interesting. Sometimes it could be more interesting. And I definitely want to get into that with you, Lance.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much.
But for now, anyway, that's all we've got. And I just want to thank everyone for listening. And just remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.